So I would like to introduce our speaker, Mrs. Trina Gibbons Henry. Again, she is here to speak about cultural wellness and the importance of ethnic identity formation in children. Mrs. Trina Gibbons Henry is the founder and clinical director of Healing and Restoration Consulting. She's credentialed as a LICSW, a licensed clinical social worker, and has 20 plus years of social work experience. She's had the ranges of being in case management to program coach management to a clinical supervisor. Also worked in Hennepin County crisis for over 15 years. She's also a tenure professor at the Minnesota State College, which is also known as, or used to be known as, MCTC. Her area of expertise is crisis services and working with at-risk youth and their families in trauma. Um, she's alumni of MCTC, and she's received her Associates of Science degree in Human Service with a minor in Women's Studies. She attended Augsburg College, where she earned her bachelor's degree in social work. And she also pursued her graduate degree at the U of M and got her master's, her MSW, with the emphasis in community practice. And while she graduated at the U of M, she also was selected nationally as a competitive IVE Child Welfare Bush Scholarship and is recognized as an IVE scholar. Um, so that is just the little we know of Mrs. Trina Gibbons Henry, and I will hand it over to her. Thank you, and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Triasia, my beautiful daughter, for the wonderful introduction. I kind of got lost. I was like, is she talking about me? And I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of old. But thank you all for being here, for such a wonderful conversation and just a facilitation of learning about ethnic identity and the importance of that in childhood. Um, I see here we have several people here, and I'm so glad that you could make it tonight. Um, I'm such a natural facilitator. I like conversations while I'm going, but because this is being taped, we're going to make sure we have those conversations at the end. So for the Q&A, but at different times of the presentation, I'm going to give you things to think about or to ponder. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll make sure we get those answered. Okay. All right. Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Awesome. Okay. So, welcome. Today, we're going to talk about healthy ethnic identity formation in childhood. Um, when we talk about ethnic, we're going to interchangeably talk about race. Um, we all know that race is not biologically or scientifically um, related when we're talking about biology. However, when we're talking about social constructs, we use the word race. So race is going to be kind of interchangeable with ethnic, okay, in the presentation. So I wanted to make sure to highlight that. So for the presentation, what you will be able to understand after the presentation, you will be able to define ethnic identity formation. You will also be able to understand and identify stages of ethnic identity formation and various different concepts or research around this work. Understand and apply concepts that will promote healthy ethnic identity formation in children, and also apply concepts to buffer and protect children's self esteem and provide a healthy ethnic identity formation in the community and larger society. Any questions about the learning outcomes? Or is there something else that you may have wanted to have within um, this presentation? Please put in the chat and then we can talk about that more. Okay, so let's get started with defining ethnic identity and development. Ethnic identity refers to the group with which an individual identifies, so the ethnic group you identify more with. Ethnic identity development includes the formation of that identity, and so how individuals self categorize themselves, and then also the psychological attachment to an ethnic group. So when we talk about ethnic identity development, it's very multifaceted and it's very, very complex. Dr. Beverly Tandem, she argues that youth of color and indigenous youth develop their racial and ethnic identity through socialization. So when they're around in their neighborhoods and they have lived experiences within those neighborhoods or their schools, that's how they become to understand who they are. And even in their home, they start to understand who they are, and also identify, what it means, what this identification means of being Black, being African American or Latinx, Asian American, Native, or other biracial ethnicities or by ethnicities. And now with social media, people often too find that experience to kind of inform who they are. So that's a whole nother set of things of how or complexities to add to how children self identify within their groups. So we're going to think about this more in our context. So I'm going to share a story, a story about my how I became aware of my ethnic identity. And then also one that I remember about my youngest son and his experience. When I was I was in fourth grade. And at that time, I'm trying to think back, it's been a while, but I can think back when I was that age. I'm going to stop sharing right now, then I'll come back to the slide so I could see you. Okay. So I remember I was about about 9 years old, and my sister had to be 5. She was in kindergarten. And I was raised in Chicago, Illinois. But in my family, we were very multi-generational. We have a very blended bi-ethnic family. So different languages, different colors, that we had, shades of complexions that we shared. So for me, it wasn't odd to see that. But as I started to go to school and my sister, we started to go to school, we seen that that was very different. Chicago in that time, I would say during the 70s, was very segregated. I think it's becoming a little bit better, but it was very segregated during that time. So various different ethnic groups kind of stay within themselves and within the neighborhood. So my experience within the neighborhood was people that reflected me. So as a Black woman, we had teachers, we had police officers, the neighborhood was African American, and most of the people in that area had homes and they had multi generational families in that home. So meaning the grandmother, the uncles, the aunts until they married off and then they went on, with their lives. However, I remember that one of our peers came up to us, and my sister she's very light complected or fair skinned. And so one of the children said, "Are you guys really sisters? Or, was one of you guys adopted? Do you guys got the same mom and the same dad? Like, what was going on?" And I was just looking like, and I looked at my sister, she looked at me like, what are they talking about? Yes. We didn't understand that because of complexities in our family. But as we started to venture out, we started to learn about those differences. And so we went back home and talked to our family about it, and they talked to us about how we all have different, you know um complexions, and how that doesn't represent who you are. What represents who you are is what you learn, your values, like you're family oriented and you stick together, and your belief in a higher, creator. Those are the things that are your values. And so I remember my grandmother saying that. And so that was kind of my first experience with ethnic identity. And my son, he had a different analogy of that, because he didn't have that experience. He was raised in Minnesota and he was the baby, so he went to private schools. And he had an age difference, between his siblings. And so he went to a private school um, that was mostly white and European. So that's what he knew. And so as he aged, I think he was about, Treasure, you can comment on this, about, I think he was in third grade or fourth grade. And so he came home, he said, "Mom, you always cut my hair, and I don't want you to cut my hair anymore." And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, because I want my hair to grow out straight and it's going to be blonde." And I'm like, my poor baby. I think we got to have a conversation because that's not going to happen for you. So it was funny then, but I just think about the dynamics of, he's starting to think about this. He's starting to see, in his environment, and starting to attach to symbols that may not represent him, right? So it's very important to me to have that conversation with him, not to demonize him, not to demonize the other children, but to say it's okay that you're different and that's not going to happen for you. But also make sure that he has a healthy view of who he is, and get him more around his peers that look like him. So having more exposure is important. So those are kind of some stories from my end. And I want you to think about or ponder about what your first experience was. Um, when you were faced with ethnic identity, or start to think about ethnic identity and who you were ethnically. So I want you to think about that. And then as we get closer to the end, we can have those open conversations about that and how that informed you, good or bad or ugly, but then how too that you can repair that and then have those open spaces for your children. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to my slide. Okay, I kind of pushed too far along. Now we're going to get into talking about some models. Models is research, just body of work that focuses on ethnic identity. I always like to say a theory is like a roadmap of how to do things, or what people find to be helpful. And so there's several theorists that follows this work. And some of the theorists that we're going to talk about today have various different concepts around or frameworks around ethnic racial identity. It's important to keep in mind, though, some of these perspectives, people look at it as a model where people go through different stages. And then some theorists feel that it's more of an orientation, meaning that this is something that you can look for with children within that area of ethnic development. So it's not really a stage, but more of an overall orientation of how it may look in various children within that ethnic group. So there's a perspective on American Indian identity development, and this was developed by Perry Horse. This was his work around ethnic identity development. And he proposes that there's 5 influences that affect Native American consciousness around who they are and understanding the development of Native Americans. And he looks at this as not to refer to this idea as an identity model. So this is what he notes, that this is not a linear stage model that youth will progress through in order. So it's more of what they start to understand during their development. So, number one, he talks about the extent to which one is grounded in one's Native American language and culture, one's cultural identity. He also talks about the validity of one's American Indian genealogy. So, kind of researching more about what your tribal genealogy is. The extent to which one holds a traditional American Indian general philosophy or worldview, which emphasizes balance and harmony and drawing on Indian spirituality. One self concept as an American Indian. And number 5, one's enrollment or lack of it in a tribe. So basically, it's for children to start to embrace who they are, they're understanding their lineage, and then also understanding their self concept as an African American in today's society. So, what that looks like for them. Asian American Identity Development Model. This framework identifies a continuous process that leads Asian Americans to form a positive racial identity. So they look at this as a continuum. Number 1, they talk about ethnic awareness stage. I'm not going through each of these models specifically, but there's a few that I really want to touch on more closely. Because of the makeup in Minnesota, I will focus on some models more in depth. So Asian American Identity Model. 1 was ethnic awareness stage. This starts in early childhood around ages 3 or 4. At this stage, the family serve as a significant ethnic group model. And depending on around the time of ethnic expression in household, this can make a positive or a neutral attitude. That's when neutral or positive attitudes are formed. White identification stage. begins once children enter school, and peers and the school environment become powerful forces in conveying and reinforcing racial prejudice. Number three, awakening of social political consciousness stage means the adoption of a new perspective, usually associated with increased political awareness and an understanding of oppression and oppressed groups. And number four, the redirection stage. This is characterized by a reconnection and pride with one's Asian American heritage and culture. This is often followed by a realization of white privilege and oppression as the reason for the negative experience of Asian communities. Anger about white racism may be a part of this stage. And then incorporating stage represents the highest form of identity evolution. It includes a positive and comfortable identity as Asian Americans and a respect for other racial cultural groups. The feelings of association for or against white culture are no longer an important issue. It's more about incorporating your identity within that group. Okay. Also, I'm going to go into a little bit more about the Black American racial identity development, the Latino identity orientation. This was first founded by Dr. Friedman and Dr. Gallegos. They proposed that individuals develop orientations or lenses through which they view their identity. So, in other words, they feel like this is more of an orientation. This is not a linear stage model that youth will progress through in order. So it's nothing that they are going to do. They feel like you take this step, this step, this step, and then you end up here. So this is more of an orientation. So number one was Latino integrated, understanding of racial constructs and the ability to challenge them. Number two, Latino identified, acceptance of the race Latino and white and identification with Latino. Subgroup identified, identify identification of multiple Latino races and identification with a regional subgroup. Sometimes people have a lot of questions about the subgroup piece um, and identifications with regional subgroups because there's complexities. We know there's complexities in each culture or ethnic group. So the subgroups is just meaning how people communicate, how they see their different identification as a Latino. Latino as other, identification as a generic Latino due to mixed heritage. And undifferentiated, color blindness, adherence to dominant culture, and tendency to attribute failure to the individual rather than racial constructs. And white identified, acceptance of white and Latino races and and identification with white and rejection of Latino. So those are the different orientations that them as theorists feel that people can align with when they're forming their identification. And some things is to look for in this model, of course, again, is one's own ability to gravitate towards the positive of their culture, but also immersion their self in others, in other cultures. Okay. And then the white racial identity development model by Janet Helms. Um, this model is a stage related model. And we're going to get into this a little bit more in depth. And then also the biracial identity development model. This is also a stage development model um, for bi-ethnic individuals. Okay, so that's a lot of information. I wanted to do just a quick breakdown. Before I go into the next slide to give um, more information about how these perspectives are used, do anybody have questions about these different models or specific questions? And you can put those in the chat. So we'll have those questions for the end.
Miss Trina, your PowerPoint is in on presenter mode, and so we could see the font well. I can only see it in small font, and I don't believe it was advancing as you were speaking.
Oh,
There we
okay.
go. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Okay. So this is where I was at. And I just shared more information about the models. But again, we will have the follow-up information on these two. Okay, so how you apply these ethnic identity frameworks. The frameworks summarized here describe people who are situated in many different ways, but they do not describe all of the possibilities. These frameworks can be used as tools for self-reflection, for building empathy and understanding of individuals who are different from you. So the purpose of these is to make you aware of different research that's out there around identity development and how it's a very important part of a person's overall personal identity. You know, this is a part of their overall sense of belonging and well-being. So it's very important that we start to understand ethnic identity. And I think too, because of what's going on today with the uprising of racial and social injustices, it's very important that we understand who we are. Our past informs our future. So it's very important that we understand who we are, and not allow social media or politicians or other views that does not describe to who you are damper that, especially for the children. I think there's so much information, but sometimes research is showing that children are looking at this information and their self-esteem is crushing. So their self-esteem is being affected by what they're seeing. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the white racial identity formation. Um, Dr. Him has done extensive research around this model. And the reason why this model is so popular because this framework identifies a continuum that leads to white individuals developing an anti-racist white identity. And many people talk about how do you do that? It's just going to always be around. But that's true, but it's a choice in how you form that. And also the way you teach your children about who they are. So Ms. Helm talks about her work in these 6 stages. And so the first one is contact. In this stage, individuals adhere to the colorblind motto. I think you hear that a lot. We're all human, which that's true. Race is a social construct. So in other countries, you may not see race used as much, the different categories, I would say, of ethnicity used as much. This is mostly for the United States. And that's with identity formation, and also with the research is based in the United States because we have more studies with categories and within ethnic groups. But we know as a race, we're all are human beings. There's no differences in race. So we're all human beings. However, um, in the United States, race is was formatted as a social construct to provide for different gains um, for people politically, socially, and financially. So that's a whole nother topic. But when we talk about race identity, it's very important that you understand that. So, with contact being colorblind, that's the model in this stage. So, if an individual is confronted with real world experience of knowledge that uncovers the privilege of being white, they may move into the disintegration stage. So, disintegration, this in this specific stage, they challenge new information and experiences. So then the individual becomes increasingly conscious of their whiteness. So in the contact, initially, you're not thinking about color. Everybody's the same. And this integration, now you're starting to have more experiences where you can see, hey, I do have some privilege. I see how that privilege plays out. Reintegration is the stage is characterized by a blame the victim attitude and a more conscious belief in white racial superiority. During this stage, individuals have a tendency to idealize their own racial group and to be intolerant of others. Um, and stage 4, pseudo independence. During this stage, which is the first stage of positive racial identification, is when individuals begin to understand white privilege. And then also related to that, they're also able to identify biases, prejudice, and discrimination on an intellectual level. At this stage, the individual does not feel that whiteness deserves privilege. So they're kind of coming out of that blaming the victim, but it's more as, I see this as um, not something that's a deserved privilege, but that has been a socially constructed. Immersion versus immersion. In this stage, individuals make a genuine attempt to connect to their own white identity and to be anti racist. This stage is usually accompanied by deep concern with understanding and connecting to other whites who are or confronting issues of racism and oppression. This stage is marked by increasing experiential and effective understanding. So, immersion is that you're merging more with others and you're understanding various different viewpoints. And the final stage is autonomy. This last stage is reached when an individual has a clear understanding of and positive connection to their white racial identity, while also actively pursuing social justice. Individuals at this stage are knowledgeable about racial, ethnic, and cultural differences, value diversity, and accept their role in perpetuating racism. And I think if you identify as someone that is white, I want you to think about these stages and where you lie in those stages. And think about how you can reach immersion or autonomy. We know with the research, there's other ways that people, move through life, right? So with research, there's always limitations. However, what the research did find is that people that have really looked in and reflected on these stages and really was intentional about moving to autonomy, moving to get a better understanding from other people or other worldviews, starting to just be collective, going out to dinner with someone of a different ethnic group, inviting them over, emerging with the community, attending various different cultural events, become more knowledgeable about different perspectives, and have an overall enriching relationships, and are able to navigate cross culturally. And I think with the increase with our population, we want that for our children. We have to prepare our children for a global society and to be able to navigate within that in a healthy manner. So, Black and American racial identity model. So, this, I'm sorry, here we go. So, Black and American racial identity research was formulated by William Cross. This, this framework identifies a continuum that leads to Black Americans to form a positive racial identity. So, number one, he talks about the pre encounter. The individual absorbs many of beliefs and values of the dominant white culture, including the notion that white is right and Black is wrong. So the two encounter, number two is encounter. This stage begins in adolescence, from middle school or high school, when a teen or young adult is forced by an event or series of events to acknowledge the impact of racism in their life. For example, being followed around by security guards at the mall, or viewing media image of police brutality against Black men and women. Immersion versus immersion. During this transitional point in the model, the individual simultaneously desires to surround themselves with visible symbols of their own racial identity and actively avoid symbols of whiteness. The individual begins to actively seek out opportunities to explore aspects their own history and culture with supports of members from their own racial background. Internalization. Secure in their own sense of racial identity, the individual becomes willing to establish meaningful relationships with whites, I'm sorry, not with white, with whites, who acknowledge and are respective of their own self-definition. The individual is now ready to begin coalitions with members of other oppressed groups. And the last stage, internalized commitment. During the fifth stage, anchored in their positive sense of racial identity, individuals have found ways to translate their own personal sense of Blackness into a plan of action or general sense of commitment to concerns of Blacks as a group, which is sustained over time. So, within the Black American racial identity model, this formulates how internalized oppression can look like in these encounters. And as children start to develop into youth, starting to begin to voice more concerns or have the interactions, with injustices, and that may peak. And so students can either go, or, children can either go on the opposite end of really being rebellious towards those, the injustices, and internalize it, or they can be buffered with healthy supports with their family. Like in number 5, that talked about the internalization and commitment of being who they are, but also be able to immerse in other groups, but to not deny who they are and not deny the issues that stand before them, and be a part of change over time. The last stage, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about, is the biracial identity development. Biracial identity development by Carlos Poston he studied the biracial theory around identity development. Number one is a personal identity. Sense of self unrelated to ethnic grouping occurs during childhood. And I think that's for probably mostly all of the theories that we talked about today, is that children starts to understand, start to see maybe around 3 years old, like, the differences, but really do not have the sophistication to really understand the categories and what that means for them in life. Um, so as children get older, normally within the adolescence or or a little bit before adolescence, middle school, they start to try to figure out what groups they want to be a part of. And so this is especially important for children that are bi-ethnic, biracial identity. They often feel like they have to, fit in a group. So choice of group as a result of multiple factors. Individuals feel pressured to choose one racial or ethnic group identity over another. Categorization. Choice is influenced by status of the group, parental influence, and cultural knowledge and appearance. Number four is enmeshment, denial. Guilt and confusion about choosing an identity that isn't fully expressive of all their cultural influences. Denial of differences between the racial groupings. Possible exploration of the identities that were not chosen in stages 2 or 3. Number five, appreciation of multiple identities. Number six, integration, sense of wholeness, integrating multiple identities. This is when a person is becoming informed about both of their heritages and or identity, ethnic identity, and they're starting to absorb the positive values that each of those bring and able to integrate those in their lives. So it's very important in this stage that children are not pressured, but they're exposed to positive identity, racial identity formations in both groups. Um, and I think with every stage, there's kind of that same message of making sure that we're exposing the children to who they are, the good and bad and ugly, but also letting them develop who they are and where they fit in, but then also having them explore their ethnic background in detail and really seeing the positives in that and the strengths in that. Okay. So those are the main type of um, identity formation models that you may see, and that has been researched over time. And I'll give you a list of resources too if you want to continue to read about this topic. It's very interesting and it's very important. I think that this should be taught and really talked about. When I teach on this in classes in the college setting, I'm always enamored to hear how students never had the opportunity to really talk about their ethnic identity. It's either black or white. It's either, you're a person of color or it's not a real conversation about the richness of what that means. And so I challenge parents and I challenge schools to start to really promote healthy ethnic identity formation in children, really having those conversations with their parents and with them about what makes them fit in, how that works, what makes them go, what makes them get up in the morning, what are their beliefs, what are their values, and how does that play out for them. Also, learning more about themselves and not the social ills. I remember I had a student, we talked about ethnic formation, and I asked them about what is some of your values? What are something that's important for you? And what is something that you've seen in your family that was passed down to you? And again, this is a college setting. And again, I was very taken back by the lack of knowledge about the importance of their values and understanding around their values. I had students say, well, my family, um, maybe they drank a lot, you know, and they had a history of chemical dependency, or we really struggled with poverty. And I said, okay, those are social ills. That's not a part of your cultural values. What are some of the values you were raised in? So what did your parents do when you didn't have enough? You know, what did they do? And so then you start to get the real values and beliefs. My mom really worked hard. My mom worked two jobs. So she really believed in providing for us. That's what I'm talking about. So, really encouraging them to think about their values, not the social ills. That's something that everyone experienced today. Everyone is a third of the population is probably a paycheck away, right? Of landing in poverty. So, with everything increasing, think about what helped you to overcome. What did your family believe in? And I would hear students say, we lived together. So you were really close. You guys stayed together, you were close. So cohesion, that's very important. Family values, making sure your family's okay. So really making sure to encourage healthy ethnic development by by really talking about who they are, their beliefs, what's passed down to them. What is the resiliency factor in them? What makes their family whole? And really not ignoring it. And not ignoring that. And then kids will have the funniest thing to say to you. I talked about my son's experience, and he really did not know because he was being informed by his environment. So, really exposing children to diverse and culturally responsive literature, not only literature, but art, images, things that they can relate to, the books that you provide, the television shows. I really monitor, I think my children, they said, Mom, you're so old fashioned, but I really monitor what my grandchildren look at. I try to. But I'm glad that they're really taking on that the importance of making sure they're exposed to um, things that don't create problems with their self-esteem or overall identity. Also, exposing children to environments that are inclusive and demonstrate visually images that reflect their experience in a positive light, and exposing children to all aspects of their racial ethnic makeup and history. And today it's really important to do that. I mean, you have so many um you can do genetic testing now. You can learn more, with children with a globe and talk about where you're from and research some of those ethnic things. I think we don't even do that, and that's important for us to do that. It's just really getting down deeper into who we are, what we came from, and how that informs us today. And these are some resources. I really like Beverly Tatum's work, Dr. Beverly Tatum's work. Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? She revised the book. But that's a really good resource. It really talks about the importance of identity development. There's also several journals that you can read if you want more information that gives really good information about things you can do. So I'm going to stop share. So we can have time for questions. I like to have conversations